Craig.
Great. Thanks, Gordon. Good afternoon, everyone. And hello, Michael. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Ward. As you may have seen in his bio, he is an author and an actor and an academic and a priest. And I don't know many of us who could claim all of those professions. So he's a member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Oxford and is also a professor of apologetics at Houston Christian University. So Michael, we're very much looking forward to your talk, C.S. Lewis on Appearance and Reality in the Christian Life. And so I will now turn it over to you. Michael, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Appearance and reality in the Christian life. Yes. C.S. Lewis on that subject. It's a subject which occupied him both before and after he became a Christian. That is to say, the conflict or the disparity between appearance and reality. The opening paragraph of his first work of non-fiction Christian apologetics, Problem of Pain, begins like this. Let me quote it to you in a slightly abbreviated form. That will lead us to this topic. By the way, there's someone whose audio I can hear. Can you turn off your audio, please, if that's you? Thank you. That's better. This is how the Problem of Pain opens. Not many years ago, when I was an atheist, if anyone had asked me, why do you not believe in God? My reply would have run something like this. Look at the universe we live in. By far, the greatest part of it consists of empty space, completely dark and unimaginably cold. The bodies which move in this space are so few and so small in comparison with the space itself, that even if every one of them were known to be crowded as full as it could hold with perfectly happy creatures, it would still be difficult to believe that life and happiness were more than a byproduct to the power that made the universe. As it is, however, the scientists think it likely that very few of the suns of space, perhaps none of them except our own, have any planets, and in our own system it is improbable that any planet except the Earth sustains life. And Earth herself existed without life for millions of years, and may exist for millions more when life has left her. And what is it like while it lasts? Human history is largely a record of crime, war, disease, and terror, with just sufficient happiness interposed to give these human beings, while it lasts, an agonized apprehension of losing it, and, when it is lost, the poignant misery of remembering. That's Lewis as an atheist. And then he goes on. Every race, every human race that comes into being, every race amongst mankind that comes into being in any part of the universe is doomed, for the universe itself is running down and will sometime be a uniform infinity of homogeneous matter at a low temperature. All stories will come to nothing. All life will turn out in the end to have been a transitory and senseless contortion upon the idiotic face of infinite matter. If you ask me to believe that this is the work of a benevolent and omnipotent spirit, I reply that all the evidence points in the opposite direction. Either there is no spirit behind the universe, or else a spirit indifferent to good and evil, or else an evil spirit. That's a positive and charming note on which to start, I think you'll agree. But that was Lewis citing his own beliefs when he had been an atheist. He had thought that the universe was bleak, cold, meaningless, purposeless, and that there was no God, or at least not a good God, in charge of the whole show. But of course, C.S. Lewis became, first of all, a theist. He came to believe in the existence of God, and then he became a Christian in his early 30s. He came to believe that there was indeed an omnibenevolent and omnipotent spirit. he hadn't suddenly become blind to all these problems, all these pains, the record of crime, war, disease, and terror. You know, he could remember that well enough. He himself had fought in the First World War and had been very nearly killed in the trenches of France. He had seen the very old and the very recent dead, he said. He remembered the smell of high explosives and so on and so forth. But he had come somehow, and we don't have time to go into this story, he had come somehow to a belief that despite all these appearances to the contrary, that God was in charge of history and creation. There was a divine hand on the tiller of human experience, guiding things, shaping things, giving things meaning and purpose. God was working his purposes out as year succeeds to year. All things were working together for good for those who love God, and so on and so forth. All the standard beliefs that any Christian holds. And yet, there were so many appearances to the contrary. So how did what is it about Lewis that is going to be of use to us this afternoon when we consider this disjunction between the cruel appearances that meet us and which we cannot deny if we're honest, and the reality, the spiritual reality as every Christian believes it to be, that God is indeed creative, sustaining, redeeming the created order. This conflict between the two, between appearance and reality, was a matter that Lewis returned to many times in the course of his writings. Let me give you just a couple of examples. In The Great Divorce, for instance, he depicts how visitors from hell go on a day trip. They get on a bus and go on a day trip up to heaven, or rather the outskirts of heaven. And they get shown around the outskirts of heaven. And they find that heaven is too solid for them, because these ghost-like phantasmal creatures from hell can't stand on the grass. It cuts their feet. They can't even dare to go close to a waterfall in case the spray from the waterfall cuts them like bullets. They find that heaven is apparently unbearable, intolerable for them. But only apparently, that is the thing, because one of these visitors from hell gives up his sin, his little souvenir of his hellish existence, and he allows it to be killed. And then, having turned his back on sin, he is redeemed. And he suddenly finds himself reconstituted as a being who can stand on the grass, who can lift an apple from the ground, who can get wet by the spray and not just obliterated by the spray from the waterfall as if it were bullets. In other words, his initial understanding of the appearance of heaven turns out to have been just that, an appearance, a perception, not the reality. And when he gives up his selfishness, when he begins to worship someone other than himself, in other words, when he falls in love with God, then reality floods in upon his senses, and he's able to find himself at home in heaven. Another example is Till We Have Faces, Lewis's last novel, a myth retold, which Lewis regarded as easily his best work. But in that story, which is set in pre-Christian times in a barbarian kingdom, the main character is a queen of this barbarian land, and her name is Orwell. And she has a complaint against the gods, the pagan gods of the nearby mountain. And she accuses the gods of being cruel and antithetical to human flourishing. In a way, what Orwell says against the gods is very much what C.S. Lewis said against God himself in the opening paragraph of The Problem of Pain. But rather like the visitor from hell in The Great Divorce who gets transformed. Orwell herself comes to a new understanding of reality as the story progresses, and she realizes that her initial understanding of the gods was mistaken, that she was just taking for reality what was merely an appearance. So there we've had three examples: the pre-Christian Lewis, the visitor from hell in The Great Divorce, Orwell Until We Have Faces. All of these people who are outside of God's illuminating spirit, and their perception is changed. They're like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. The scales fall from their eyes. And rather than regarding, as in St. Paul's case, the church as something to be persecuted, they regard it now as something to be joined and to be beloved. But interestingly, Lewis continues with this tension between appearance and reality, even when he depicts the Christian life. So, for instance, in an address that he gave to the Socratic Club, the Oxford Debating Society, of which he was president for many years, an address called On Obstinacy in Belief, he homes in on this very same question. Let me quote you a little bit from On Obstinacy in Belief. He says this: if human life is in fact ordered by a beneficent being, namely God, whose knowledge of our real needs and of the way in which they can be satisfied infinitely exceeds our own, we must expect a priori that his operations will often appear to us far from beneficent and far from wise, and that it will be our highest prudence to give him our confidence in spite of this. This expectation is increased by the fact that when we accept Christianity, we are warned that apparent evidence against it will occur, evidence strong enough to deceive, if possible, the very elect. And then he goes on to say that this problematic situation that we meet as Christians, that we know so little and we have to trust so blindly at times, it seems, that situation, he says, is rendered tolerable by two facts. One is that occasionally we do get very favorable evidence that this trust, this belief is warranted. And the second fact that makes it tolerable is that we realize, we gradually become to perceive that what is being required of us is not so much knowledge of our situation as love in our situation. He says that we move from the logic of speculative thought to the logic of personal relations. And in a personal relationship, in a relationship of love and trust, there may well be occasions when you are faced with what apparently looks like infidelity. You know, you've arranged to meet someone and they don't turn up. And as the clock ticks by, you begin to think, maybe they're standing me up. Maybe they don't want to meet after all. And you might well eventually write them off and say, well, I've lost all trust in them. And then the very next moment they turn up with a very good explanation as to why they were delayed. And you would feel, I should have known them better. I should have given them more trust. I should have been more patient. In other words, the relationship of personal love and trust and so on is what is gradually being developed by these various tests and these trials and these tribulations. And that's the most valuable kind of knowledge that there is, the knowledge of acquaintance, not the knowledge of fact. And that distinction between the two kinds of knowledge, knowing about someone from the outside and knowing them truly from within, is a major fact to consider when we're considering Lewis's approach to the distinction between appearance and reality. But that's non-fiction on obstinacy in belief, where he's addressing it in the course of a university lecture. Lewis depicts that very same situation, the logic of personal relations, in a number of places in his fiction. So, for instance, in Prince Caspian, the second book in the Narnia series, the children get lost in the woods. And suddenly Lucy, the youngest of them, says that she can see Aslan, the Lion King, the Christ-like lion, and that he's beckoning her and the whole party of children to follow him in the direction precisely opposite to the one that they've been planning to take. But the other children can't see Aslan, only Lucy can see him. And so they take a vote as to who's right. And Lucy is in the minority, and she's overruled, and they go off under their own steam, ignoring this apparent summons from the divine lion. And as you will remember, if you can recall Prince Caspian, they go off on a dead end. Where they were planning to go is not the right place at all, and they have to retrace their steps. And then Lucy sees Aslan a second time, and again he beckons her, and she says, well, what do I do this time? Do I have to come on my own if the others won't follow me, if the others won't believe that I really can see you? And Aslan says, well, yes, you will. And you won't be alone either, because you'll be with me. And eventually Lucy is required to go and wake up the others. This is in the nighttime that this happens, and she's faced with this horrible situation of having to go and wake people, all of them older than her and very tired, who and ask them to believe in something that they cannot see. But she does it because she is living into this personal relationship that she has with Aslan, and she knows that it's a question of trust, not a question of observable scientific fact. In The Silver Chair, you have another example when the adventurers, the two children from England and Puddleglum the Marshwiggle, they go down into the underworld kingdom where they find a witch, and the witch tries to convince them that there is no overland, that her subterranean kingdom is all that there is, and that their memories of the overland, they're just a phantasmal appearance. They're not a reality. But Puddleglum insists, no, it is real. I can remember. And indeed, he says to the witch, we met you up there. And in a marvelously dramatic moment, Puddleglum stamps on the fire in the underworld kingdom, this fire where the witch has been throwing a special deceiving powder that fills the air and befogs their minds. And with a sharp dose of pain, Puddleglum's mind clears, and he now remembers very clearly that the overworld does exist. It's not just an appearance, it is a reality, and he's going to go and search for it even if he can't find it. The search for it will be better than living with this witch in her underground kingdom. And then in the last battle, just to give you one final example, you remember how in that story, there's a kind of antichrist character, this demon god called Tash, and he manages to deceive so many of the faithful Narnians that they become almost persuaded that Tash and Aslan are one character, and this word Tashlan is used instead of Aslan, suggesting that the two are really one. And the king of Narnia, that part of the story, whose name is Tyrion, is for a moment deceived. Horrible thoughts go through his mind. But then his mind clears, and he realizes that it's all a cheat, and that no, the reality is as he has always known it, that Aslan is the good and faithful king of Narnia, the high king over all human kings, and that this is just a lie from this demonic insurgency. So we find repeatedly in Lewis's work that he's interested in the conflict between appearance and reality, both from outside the faith, and then even once you're inside the faith, once you have a Christian faith, even then, appearance and reality are not always in sync, and you have to trust, you have to have faith in the reality that you know to be the case, despite all appearances to the contrary. Now, this is, I think, of such significance for C.S. Lewis that he very cleverly and interestingly developed his own false appearance, as it were, in his fiction, in the Narnia Chronicles. He gave the Narnia Chronicles an appearance of a lack of design, a lack of imaginative logic, and was prepared for people to dismiss Narnia as a bit slapdash and slipshod in terms of its imaginative creation. All the while, he, Lewis, the creator of Narnia, knew precisely that there was a very deep-laid and intricate imaginative logic, imaginative blueprint that he was working to. So in the rest of my remarks, I'm going to talk a little bit about my belief that Narnia itself is a very interestingly, apparently haphazard creation, but all the while underneath, the creator's purposes are being worked out. And in this case, of course, the creator is the author himself, C.S. Lewis, and he's doing this as a kind of analogy to, or a sort of enacted parable of, this spiritual truth that we've already talked about. So Narnia has often been criticized as a bit ramshackle. The first person to complain about Narnia was actually Lewis's great friend Tolkien. Lewis read aloud the first few chapters of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to Tolkien, and Tolkien strongly reacted against what he was hearing. He couldn't understand why Lewis was putting into the story English children, fresh from the pages of an E. Nesbit story, alongside centaurs and fauns and dryads and naiads out of Greek and Roman mythology. And then you have a white witch character who seems to have come straight from the pages of a Hans Andersen fairy tale, a Snow Queen character from Hans Andersen. You have Father Christmas in the story as well. What's he doing there? And Tolkien didn't like it. He thought that those diverse literary traditions, those mythological origins, they didn't belong in a single story. And he soon gave up showing any interest in Narnia, and he didn't read all the books even once when they were published, though he admitted that they were deservedly popular, and he kept copies in his house for his grandchildren to read, but he said they were outside his own range of imaginative sympathy, which is a polite way of saying he didn't like them. But if you know Tolkien's work, you know that his created land of Middle-earth is a very different sort of world from Narnia. It's refined and polished to the nth degree of perfection, with whole languages created and etymologies and genealogies and cartographies. And The Lord of the Rings was published with numerous appendices giving you all the backstory. Tolkien was very much of the view that a sub-created world that an author makes for his story should have what he called an inner consistency of reality, that wherever you strike it, as it were, it should ring true. And Narnia is obviously a very different kind of world from that. And Tolkien's objection to Narnia, on the face of it, does look warranted. I mean, we can't really deny that Narnia does seem to have been assembled out of very disparate mythological traditions. However, other people have said, well, maybe Narnia is bound together maybe Narnia has a more satisfactory unity and design and pattern when we consult the biblical parallels in the stories. Aslan is a Christ-like character. He's the only character who appears in all 7 books, and he does a lot of Christ-like things straight out of the pages of the Bible. So maybe that's the unity. And when you look at The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where you see the Narnian gospel story being reenacted, and the magician's nephew with the Narnian creation story, and the last battle with the Narnian apocalypse, you think, oh yes, strong, clear biblical parallels. This must be what ties the series together. A fairly clear one-to-one relationship between Narnian events and biblical events. But I've just listed 3 out of 7 chronicles, less than half the series, in other words. And when you look at the other 4 chronicles, well, it's not so obvious how they relate to the Bible. Aslan is still in these stories, yes, and he's still Christ-like in various ways, but there's no major element or episode of Christ's life and ministry that's being reenacted. You might have expected Lewis to give us a Narnian equivalent of the Annunciation or the Nativity of the Christ character. You might have expected a Narnian equivalent of the Ascension of Christ or the day of Pentecost when Christ's Spirit is sent on the church, but you don't get that either. All of that is missing from Narnia, and instead what you do get in those 4 chronicles is a lot of material which doesn't seem to have very obvious connections to the Bible at all. In Prince Caspian, Aslan enters the story amongst dancing trees before giving a great war cry. And in the next chronicle, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Aslan is seen flying in a sunbeam as a bird. In the Silver Chair, Aslan doesn't actually come down to Narnia at all, but is confined to his high country above the clouds, which doesn't seem like a very Christian way of depicting your Christ character if he's still, as it were, up in heaven and isn't incarnated into the magical world. That's more like an Old Testament, more like a Judaic understanding of God. And in The Horse and His Boy, Aslan is mistaken for 2 lions or possibly 3 lions. And he does a great deal of dashing about in that story. You may recall he says there was only 1 lion, but he was swift of foot. Now, I don't recall Jesus in the New Testament being a notable sprinter or having a special ministry to athletes. So why did Lewis make that imaginative decision? Why depict his Christ character as Speedy Gonzales, as it were, in that story, but in none of the others? So when we look at the Narnia Chronicles, even from this biblical point of view, 3 of the books seem to be very well explained, and 4 of them much less well explained. But Lewis was very interested in complexity and intricacy. He was a medieval scholar, and he once said of the medieval mind that it was marked by a love of complexity. Writers like Chaucer and Dante, and then later writers like Spencer and Milton, they love to present us, he said, with something which at first looks planless, though all is planned. Everything leads to everything else in these stories, he says, but often by very intricate paths. And we know from Lewis's own poetry that Lewis himself loved very complex metrical and phonetic patterns in his poetry. He once said that the poems which look as if they're in free verse are often in the most complicated meters of all. So Lewis, both as a literary critic, literary historian, looking back at medieval writers, knew that writers could present works which at first look planless, though all is planned, and in his own poetry, he would present poems which look as if they're in free verse, when actually they're in the most complicated meters of all. And I think when he came to write Narnia, he was operating on a similar principle. Narnia, both at the literary level and at the level of the obvious biblical parallels, is actually a bit, apparently, chaotic. There doesn't seem to be very much design and pattern. And that's why quite a lot of scholars and critics have said, oh, they were just dashed off in an afternoon. Lewis, it was a grab bag. He pulled in anything that happened to take his fancy, and that there's no unifying scheme. There's no coherent imaginative purpose behind the Narnia Chronicles. In other words, people are saying about Narnia what Lewis himself said about the real world, that he could discern no rhyme or reason to all the vicissitudes of human history. And here he's allowing critics, even close friends like Tolkien, to dismiss his imaginative world as itself rather random and slapdash. He's giving an appearance of chaos all the while. The reality is something quite other. So what is this other reality that I believe he was communicating or working to in a very skillful fashion? It has to do with the symbolism of the seven heavens. Lewis was a great fan of medieval cosmology. He writes about it all over his academic works. It features prominently in his poetry. He used it extensively in his Ransom trilogy of novels. He once said that, let me get up the quote, "The characters of the planets, seven heavens that is, seem to me to have a permanent value as spiritual symbols, which is especially worthwhile in our own generation. Of Saturn we know more than enough, but who does not need to be reminded of Jove, of Jupiter?" And having spent so much time in his academic works and in his other fiction writing explicitly about these seven spiritual symbols, when he came to write Narnia, he used them again, but this time implicitly, secretly, indirectly. He knew precisely what was governing the construction of each Narnia chronicle, but he wasn't going to make it obvious. In other words, he was going to present to his readers a literary analogy of the situation that faces all of us, believer or non-believer, in relationship to God. In other words, we need to trust that there's something in control, that there is logic, that there is meaning and pattern behind the ostensible appearances to the contrary, and that if we dismiss it as random mishmash, then we will have laughed too soon. We need to hold our fire. The seven heavens are best understood if you think of them in relationship with the days of the week. We have a 7-day week, and each day of the week is named after one of these seven heavens. So Saturday, of course, is named after Saturn. The sun gives us Sunday. The moon relates to Monday. And then the other 4 days of the week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, relate to, respectively, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, and Venus. And if you think in Spanish or French, it's a little bit more obvious how those days of the week are related to their governing planet. So Tuesday is martes or mardi in Spanish and French, because tu was the Norse equivalent of Mars, and so on. We needn't go through all seven, but that's the old cosmological arrangement, the idea that the Earth was static and central and surrounded by these seven heavens, each heaven with its own planet, and each planet with its own influences that it would shed upon the Earth and upon people and events, and even the metals in Earth's crust. Another feature of this old cosmological system was the idea that the heavens, that the planets as they circled around Earth were singing a perpetual Gloria, the music of the spheres. And interestingly, this music of the spheres is so constant, so perpetual, that we can't actually hear it on earth. Lewis says this in one of his academic lectures: "The music of the spheres is the only sound which has never for one split second ceased in any part of the universe. With this positive, we have no negative to contrast." Presumably, if it ever did stop, then with terror and dismay, with a dislocation of our whole auditory life, we should feel that the bottom had dropped out of our lives. But it never does. The music, too familiar to be heard, enfolds us day and night and in all ages. So there, in medieval cosmology, Lewis had an image of something which was so constant, so continual, so utterly presupposed that we fail to recognize it. We've never had an auditory experience other than this. And because we have no negative with which to contrast our positive experience, we fail to become aware of it. He likens it to the experience of people who were born near the great cataract on the Nile. They come out of their mother's womb and they're hearing this huge, great waterfall from the very first moment that they draw breath. It's formed the backdrop to their whole auditory existence. And it's only when these children grow up and travel 10, 15, 20 miles away so that they can no longer hear the waterfall, that for the first time in their lives, they hear the waterfall, because they now realize, oh, that's what was going on all this time. But until that moment, they weren't able to bring it to conscious awareness. It's like people who live next door to railway stations or underneath airports. They get so used to the noise that they no longer hear it. And we are in that situation vis-a-vis God, Lewis wants to say. But one of the reasons why we cannot perceive the reality of God in our lives is that God is so omnipresent. Lewis was interested in the verse from the letter to the Colossians, where St. Paul writes about Christ, that all things were created through him and for him, and in him all things hold together. Lewis was sufficiently interested in that verse that he paraphrased it in one of his books. He paraphrased it as, "Christ is the all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby the universe holds together." The all-pervasive principle of cohesion whereby all things hold together. And if that is true, then that means that our very understanding of Christ is held together in Christ. Yes, obviously, there's no Christ-less vantage point that we can take up from which we can survey the universe that we were living in. To adopt such a vantage point is to step into the void. All things hold together in Christ. In other words, we are in a Christ-saturated universe. We never know anything other than Christ. Like the medievals who never heard the music of the spheres because it was always going on, we never know a situation in which the divine word has not created us and is not sustaining us and is not, God willing, in the process of redeeming us. We can't get an angle on God. We can't survey God from an external spectator's point of view. And for that very reason, we can fail to perceive him. In other words, we have another great example of appearance and reality out of sync with each other. We look for God in the universe and we can't find him. Why? Because we're treating God as if God were just an object in the universe, albeit the most important object, the most important being in the universe. We think of God like that, and then we fail to see him. But God is not a being in the universe. God is the very means by which the universe itself has come to be. I am who I am, God says to Moses. He's not to be confused with anything that we can conceive or of anything of which we have a sensible apprehension. That's why so frequently in the Old Testament, the warning against idolatry is issued. You shall not make for yourself any graven image. No object and no concept of God will suffice to represent the reality of God himself. He is himself and nothing else is like him. He is unique, he is holy, he is transcendent, which is why the Archangel Michael goes around, as it were, saying, Michael, I'm interested in this because my own name is Michael. And Michael in Hebrew means, who is like God? Who is like God? Nothing. No one is like God. Only God is like God because God is holy. And he must be worshipped for himself and for no other reason. And this, as I say, puts us into a bit of a bind when it comes to ordinary knowledge of God, because we can't put God on a plane with our other experiences of knowledge, not even at the top of the pile, because he doesn't belong in the same category as any other thing of which we have knowledge. So you can see how for Lewis, our knowledge of God is hampered by our own limitations as creatures, that we're necessarily participating in God even as we try to know about God. We have our knowledge by acquaintance of God. We know God before we know anything else whatsoever. Our very ability to know is sustained by God. All things hold together in him. And so Lewis can say in his book Miracles, the fact which is in one respect the most obvious and primary fact, namely God, and through which alone you have access to all the other facts, may be precisely the one that's most easily forgotten. Forgotten not because it's so remote or abstruse, but because it's so near and so obvious. And that is exactly how the supernatural has been forgotten. Like someone who searches high and low for a pencil, only to discover that it's lodged behind his ear, we look for God every which way, forgetting the fact that our very ability to look is evidence of God. So this is an example of how appearance and reality are out of kilter with our normal way of knowing, and why we have to adopt a different category of thought, a different paradigm when it comes to our knowledge of God. God is transcendent and holy, yes, beyond all categories that we can conceive of. God, the Holy Spirit, is, as it were, inside us or behind us, as Lewis puts it. We must think of the Holy Spirit not as someone that we look at, but as someone we look along. God, the Holy Spirit, is more like eyesight than he is like something seen. And between the utterly inaccessible Father and the utterly immanent and intimate Holy Spirit, by God's grace, we have God the Son, who becomes one of us, Emmanuel, God with us, who enters into our condition, takes upon himself a human nature, and we can see in him the visible image of the invisible God. And that's the best way, really the only way of coming to any secure knowledge of this Trinitarian God. But then, of course, a further complication there is that the incarnation happened 2,000 years ago. Jesus lived on this earth for 33 years and then went back to heaven. So he can no longer be seen. And even when he was here, he could only be seen by those in his locality. So there again, you have a problem of the non-sensible nature of God's presence among us. So where does Lewis go with that? Of course, Christians believe that God is present in creation, in the created image that every human being bears of God, the image and likeness of God. We are all created in that. And so we can look at our neighbor and we can find Christ in our neighbor, and especially in the poor. Think of Jesus' words. about serving the poor and finding him in those in prison and the fatherless and the orphans and the widows and in as much as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me. Lewis also would find Christ in the Blessed Sacrament. And in a Christian neighbor too, there's a special presence of God, which we can become alive to. But in all these experiences, we are adopting a kind of perception. We're operating on a kind of frequency, which is different from that of our normal apprehensions. And that is why belief is so difficult for unbelievers, because they're operating on their regular frequencies. They can't tune in to this knowledge of God that Christians believe that is granted to us. And so this is a call to evangelism and apologetics and sharing the faith in intelligent and sensitive ways, so that we can gradually open the eyes of our non-believing friends and neighbors and families, so that they can begin to see, oh yes, there is a signal coming through on this particular frequency. I don't normally operate on that frequency, but now I'm beginning to tune the dial so that I'm not just getting static and noise, but I'm actually receiving a message. And so you can begin to perceive reality more accurately. And of course, that's what Lewis did so phenomenally well in so much of his writing, and indeed his public speaking, acquainting people with these new ways of perceiving reality through non-fiction apologetics, through propositional argument and logic and rational demonstration, but also through much more imaginative, creative, dramatic, fictional ways in Narnia, The Great Divorce, Till We Have Faces, the Screwtape Letters, and indeed his poetry. We must reach for every available weapon in our arsenal, as it were, every arrow in the quiver, in order to fight the good fight and to communicate the reality of God in Christ, which we perceive to be not just a reality, but the reality behind all appearances. And on that note, I will shut up and we can have some questions and discussion. I can't hear you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. Would love to open up to questions. If people want to just put up their hand and ask question verbally, that's great. Also feel free to pop anything in the chat and I can relay that. So open forum. Yeah, David, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the great talk, Dr. Ward. I really enjoyed that. I did have a question relating back to something you say earlier on in the talk about the importance of love over knowledge, a relationship in love, and we don't really depend so much on knowledge, but doesn't that lead us to a kind of emotionalism and fideism? If we go too far down that road, doesn't the love have to be based on some kind of knowledge? And St. Augustine said we cannot love what we do not know, and St. Thomas Aquinas said the same thing. And perhaps probably love can exceed our knowledge, but when there has to be some kind of a knowledge supporting the love, doesn't there? I just wonder what you thought.
Yes, absolutely. And I was a little bit careless in the way I phrased that comment, because yes, of course, knowledge and love are coordinate experiences. We are to grow in the knowledge and love of God in all times and in all places. What I was trying and failing to communicate was that if we're not careful, especially in the modernist and postmodernist West, where we have for several centuries been trained in a scientific mode of thinking, that we can reduce all knowledge to a scientific form of knowledge. In other words, the looking at kind of knowledge, the savoir knowledge, knowledge about God. That's the kind of knowledge which has some value, of course. C.S. Lewis was not anti-intellectual in the slightest, and he knew that there was value in, as it were, religious studies and indeed theology, studying God from an academic point of view. But none of that would necessarily be sufficient for salvation, because you have to come to a knowledge by acquaintance, which is more of which brings us more into the realm of love and personal relations. And yes, within that category of knowledge by acquaintance, there is knowledge and there is love, and they should constantly be enriching each other.
Yeah, I take your point about the scientific kind of knowledge, and we have a kind of physics without metaphysics, and there's a reduction even of the intellectual pursuit. And I think you did affirm that Lewis found the logic and demonstration important, but not the only thing he relies on. He had many other arrows in his quiver. So.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Welcome.
There's another question from Judy Taranchuk, and it's an important question, I think. Did Lewis plan out his universe ahead of time, or did he kind of come to that universe as he wrote, say, the Narnia Chronicles, Voyage to Venus, etc.?
Well, when he was writing the Narnia books, if my belief is correct that the Narnia Chronicles are structured according to the seven heavens, then Lewis says that he only had one book in mind when he started writing, and the series, the sevenfold series, grew organically as he went along. The precise nature of this decision that he took, as I believe it, to structure each chronicle according to the symbolism of one of the seven heavens, it's difficult to trace. We don't have access to the precise workings of his imagination. He says that it all began with a picture of a faun in a snowy wood carrying parcels. That was the germ of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And it's my belief that that germ itself captures in essence the clash that Lewis saw between a saturnine view of the universe and a jovial view of the universe. Of Saturn, we know more than enough. I think I read that quote. Saturn, the death-dealing symbol, old Father Time with his scythe and his hourglass. Lewis said that he and his contemporaries in the 1920s and 30s tended to live in a Saturnocentric universe, fixated upon these qualities of death and disaster and cynicism and pessimism, a very natural response to the First World War. But who does not need to be reminded of Jove? Who does not need to be reminded of the magnanimous, tranquil, festive, regal, monarchical symbol represented by Jupiter? Now, the whole Narnia series began with a picture of a faun in a snowy wood carrying Christmas parcels and an umbrella. And I think that actually that picture itself represents the clash between Saturn and Jupiter, because Saturn represents the winter, the death, the coldness. Frequently in Lewis's imagination, Saturn and winter go hand in hand. But the faun is trying to protect himself against it with his umbrella, and he's carrying parcels, the would-be Christmas parcels. And Christmas in Lewis's imagination is nearly always connected with Jupiter. So they're right in that germ of an image out of which the whole first Narnia story grew. I think we've got a clash of these two influences. And it's that leads Lewis in the direction that he eventually takes.
Great. I know we have online one of the authors who wrote a commentary or a version of the abolition of man. Dennis Danielson, do you have a question for Michael? Oh, you're muted, Dennis. Yeah. Could you unmute yourself?
Michael has really answered all of my questions on that score in After Humanity, which is a much more thorough version and elaboration and set of annotations upon Lewis's Abolition of Man. If you haven't come across it, I recommend it highly.
Just mention that title one more time.
After Humanity.
After Humanity.
And I
Thank
should
you.
mention that if anybody has not read Dennis's book, The Tao of Right and Wrong, they should look at that too. I think that's a very good retelling in sort of modern English of much of what Lewis is getting at in The Abolition of Man. And I quote Dennis several times in After Humanity, because he makes very insightful comments, I think. So you should read both After Humanity and The Tao of Right and Wrong, and then armed with
we can agree about that.
armed with both, then tackle The Abolition of Man.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Michael? Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thank you again for all your work. I so much enjoyed your explanation of Narnia and the relation to the planets and the worlds. Question: how now? I'm a scientist and I work in particle astrophysics. How do I keep alive the imaginative view of the universe, full of beings and full of sound and full of song, when so much of my work is around an empty universe with neutrinos and particles? And how do I keep that imagination up so that I see the world as a living creation rather than just dead particles moving around?
Well, that's a very deep question. I suspect that, I mean, who am I to answer that on my own steam? I have no original thoughts myself, but I can channel hopefully some of Lewis's thoughts on the topic, and I suspect that Lewis's answer to that question would be, don't short circuit your explanations. Lewis himself, you probably know, has an article called The Empty Universe, that it's very possible on a post-enlightenment paradigm to end up at an empty universe, a clockwork universe, a meaningless universe. But that's not a necessary and inevitable conclusion of the scientific revolution. It all comes back to what metaphors you choose to use in order to explain the universe to yourself, and science has a series of metaphorical explanations which are very useful. They tend to be essentially quantitative metaphors, a mathematical language, in other words, putting reality in terms of number and quantity. And that's very good. Lewis is saying nothing against that, but it's only one way of speaking. It's only one way of thinking. It's only one way of imagining. And there are other ways which are more qualitative and sensory. And I think we could say more humane, because after all, you can get a machine to run pretty well on numbers. But you can't get a machine to appreciate the northern lights, which I see behind you in your screensaver. And so if you haven't read Lewis's essay, Bluspools and Flallenspheres, or his essay, The Language of Religion, I would encourage you to look at both of them, because in both of those, Lewis is questioning the linguistic presuppositions behind science, we tend not to think of science as speaking a language. We tend to think of science as based on mathematics, but mathematics is itself a language, and it's not the only language. There are other ways of putting these things. And Lewis, as a poet, he always wanted to be a poet. He never succeeded much with his verse, but he had great poetic gifts, knowing how language can be used and deployed in prose as well as in verse. Lewis was always alive to the importance of choosing the right metaphor. The great poets, he says, are the masters of meaning, and they are creating new metaphors or revivifying old metaphors. And I think that's the way to keep alive in one's mind and heart and soul a sense of the universe as a living organism, even while one is also quite properly adopting a scientific approach.
Yes, I'll just add to that Charles Taylor has done a masterful job of that in his book, The Language Animal. Any other questions?
Yeah, Michael Hart, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ward. I just wondered if you had any comment on, and coming back to this conflict in the relationship with Tolkien and Lewis, and yet Lewis has written that he chose the form of children's literature as a way in which he could communicate truth in a different way, or the biblical story in a different way. I don't have the exact quote, but this was purposeful. And I guess the second part to that is, do you see that, you know, in terms of him being a brilliant academic and yet choosing this more simpler form with these possibly recognizable, although disparate mythological figures, but they're going to make sense to a child, or the child doesn't care because they're not critiquing on the level that the adult will. And yet the adult is sort of caught up in it anyway, because it's just absolutely wonderful story.
Yes, absolutely. Lewis said that he was writing for children only in the sense that he excluded things that he thought they would not like or understand, not in the sense that he was writing about things that were beneath adult attention. And a fairy tale, properly understood, is a universal genre. It's not just for the children. This is something actually that Lewis got in part from Tolkien. He quotes Tolkien on this topic in Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, where Tolkien points out that it was only when the genre became unfashionable in literary circles that it gravitated towards the nursery and then became associated with children and simple folk who couldn't understand a more complicated story. But of course, the great fairy tales are for adults as much as for children, and sometimes more so. I mean, if you think of a fairy tale like The Emperor's New Clothes, and all the adults in the story saying that the emperor is beautifully bedecked in gorgeous raiment when in fact he's stark naked. I mean, that's a classic example of how, as we grow older and are supposedly more sophisticated, we also open ourselves to new levels of self-deception, which a child can see through, as the child does in the story. And so he's got no clothes on. That, you know, the innocent, young, naive approach is there shown to be the wiser, the more perceptive. So that's part of an answer to your question. There was another element to your question, which I now forget.
No, I think actually you've covered it really well. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Did the Lays put up their virtual hand? Do you want to jump in, David?
Yes, thank you. and thank you, Michael, both for this presentation and for your books, your fantastic detective story. And it's really that I wanted just to address now. Lewis was, of course, interested in appearances. That is what we see. But as you point out, he fundamentally is more interested in what is coherent, what holds it all together, what are, well, some might have said the structures beneath it all. So I know you've addressed this in your books on Narnia, but I'd like to hear if you've reflected on it further. Why then, if his fascination, if his commitment really is to the reality, why does he leave us with appearance? Why was it left for you to find the code to Narnia? And Lewis seemingly was quite satisfied to leave us in the dark.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. And I think the immediate answer is that he was content to leave us with appearances because we live in a world of appearances. You know, we see through a glass darkly in this sublunary realm. It's only after death, only after sanctification, only after we enjoy the beatific vision that we will see face to face. So all our knowledge is necessarily mediated through appearances. And so there's nothing else that he could have done than present appearances. You know, any language that we use, however apparently direct and explicit, is still only a verbal approximation to the reality that we're trying to describe. It's not the reality itself. So that's one reason why he left us with appearances, because there's nothing else he could have done. And then secondly, he left us with this rather deliberately misleading appearance for the purposes of teaching us to press into reality and not rest satisfied with a penultimate account of reality. You know, I think this is in my own view, this is one of the most ingenious things underlying the whole Narnian strategy. And it speaks to Lewis's humility, really, that he was prepared for his created or his sub-created world to be dismissed as a bit of a hodgepodge, when all the while he knew how remarkably intricately developed it all was. And he was waiting for someone to come along and say, for someone to come along and allow readers' scales to fall from their eyes. Now that person happened to be me, but that's not significant. I mean, there were other people before me who came very, very, very close and saw the planetary connections in certain chronicles. It's just they didn't bother to follow those leads up and see how it all hung together. But I feel myself that this discovery is like a godsend, a gift that was put in my lap in order to share with other people, as a way of, you know, after the fact, saying about this beautiful Narnian world, there's far more going on here than meets the eye. And if you find that exciting, carry it over to the real world. That's the whole point. That it's an analogy of the situation which meets us on a vastly superior scale in reality. That's, I think, that the beautiful and just astonishingly cunning thing behind the whole approach.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, David. Anyone else who wants to jump in? Might have time for one or two more, most.
Yeah, I've got to go at any minute now.
Okay.
One last question.
Well, I have a thought if nobody else does. It's just the concept of epiphany in Lewis. And in many ways, you're kind of saying that his creative literature enhances the human ability to receive epiphany. Yeah, the idea of an inbreaking from the transcendent, or a transcendent turn from the immanent, you know, that sort of thing. You got to comment on that?
Yes, thank you. I'm glad you brought in the word epiphany. I should have used that. Not least because my own birthday is January the 6th, which is the Feast of the Epiphany, the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. They're following a star, and the star leads them to worship Christ. I've always been pleased that my birthday is January the 6th. And I mean, even before this Narnia planetary scheme occurred to me, I've always thought, oh, January the 6th is a nice birthday. And now it seems to have a double meaning in my own case. On that egocentric note, maybe we could draw to a close, because I've just arrived in Charleston for a 2-day C.S. Lewis conference, and I need to get to the first meeting.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much, Michael. Very, very much appreciate you taking the time with us. It's been a very stimulating hour and a bit, so we really appreciate your time.